We're going to talk about the immune system now. If it wasn't for the immune system, we wouldn't be here. Um, for one reason, primarily, uh, we're infected by a whole bunch of organisms that want to live in us or live on us. Many of them don't cause us any problems because the immune system keeps them down, or they've evolved a symbiotic relationship like certain bacteria in our gut that actually do things for us, such as make vitamins. But a lot of microbial organisms like viruses, bacteria, protists, fungi, multicellular animals, can cause disease. That's what a pathogen is. And their primary advantage is that they can reproduce much, 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 much faster than we can. Um, we have humans have about a 20 to 25 year uh, um, generation time, whereas bacteria and viruses and some of these other things can reproduce at an exponential rate, and they can double, let's say, every 2 hours. So you can imagine they could easily overwhelm us. And without an immune system, we would not be able to fend them off. Okay. First, also, immune systems that are not static. They change over time, which we'll learn. And they're not always as strong certain times versus others, or in terms of gender. Like women, females, usually have a stronger immune system than men, primarily because um, they have babies and they have to protect their fetuses as well as their infants from pathogens, since fetuses and infants don't have their own immune system yet. The infants are just starting to. So they get antibodies and stuff from their mother. Men don't have that. They don't have to do that. Their immune systems are weaker. But one of the downsides of having a strong immune system is that you can get what are called autoimmune diseases, where your immune system gets messed up and it doesn't recognize that your own cells are your own cells, and it starts attacking them. So that happens more often in women. Also, as you probably know, some people have immune systems that are dysfunctional. Whether it's because of HIV or something else, our immune systems are not always as strong as they could be. And so that's why, let's say we're starving, our immune systems aren't going to be very strong, and we're more likely to get sick with a pathogen. Okay. So, as I mentioned, pathogens are viruses, bacteria, protozoans or protists, that's single cell eukaryotes, like Giardia and Plasmodium, malaria parasites, things like that. A bunch of fungal infections like thrush that usually don't cause a problem. And then parasitic worms that are multicellular. All these things can cause disease. We also have a whole bunch of pathogen or microbes in our body that would cause disease, except their immune system tamps them down. So this is often what happens with AIDS patients or HIV patients. Their immune system gets destroyed from the virus, and they get these diseases that normally their immune system would hold in check. They get a type of pneumonia. They get a fungal infection called thrush. they get toxoplasmosis, a whole bunch of different things. Okay, so our immune systems can change. They can be stronger at certain times than others. Okay, and then because pathogens evolve much more rapidly than humans, we have part of our immune system is an adaptive immune system that actually evolves during our lifetime. Now, I've told you that individuals don't evolve and populations do, and selection acts on individuals. But it turns out our immune system actually does evolve. If it's infected by a certain pathogen, it is likely, it will create cells that remember that pathogen. And then in the future, it will, if it's infected again by that same pathogen, it will release all these different kinds of cells without having to figure it out. Okay? And so over time, our immune system gets, learns more and more about what has infected it, and it develops a stronger and stronger immunity. Okay, so our immune system is made up of a bunch of different parts. The first are what were called external defenses. This is the first line of defense against pathogens. In other words, we don't want to let them in. And we have all kinds of physical and chemical barriers that protect us. So our skin is designed to keep pathogens out. Also, it turns out we have bacteria on our skin that lives on our skin, lives fine, doesn't cause us any problems, and actually any microbial pathogen that infects the skin will be dealt with by those other bacteria or other viruses. Plus, we have linings in our respiratory and digestive system where things could come in, and like mucus in the respiratory system, various hydrochloric acid in our stomach and things like that. And also these what are called pili or cilia that move things along and trap things. Also, our eyes, our tears actually are antibiotic or antimicrobial and kill a lot of anything that gets in our eyes, will kill any microbial pathogens that way. And a video called Immune System, it's under Slides and Media on chapter 25. Immune System, Innate and Adaptive Immunity Explained. It's a short video, so if you please watch that. Okay, so here's our first line of defense again. Chemical agents that keep invaders from attaching or growing to body surfaces, enzymes and chemical environments such as acidic conditions in our stomach. So here's tears, contain antibacterial enzyme and antifungal enzyme. Hairs and mucus trap microbes in our nose, in our mouth, in our respiratory tract. Ears, earwax inhibits bacterial growth. Mouth saliva contains bacterial enzyme. Mucus traps microbes. Skin forms a physical barrier to pathogens and also has its own complement of microbes that actually protect it. Our digestive system usually has low pH, that means it's acidic, kills pathogens. Good bacteria in intestines outcompete bad bacteria and fungi and viruses. So, or good viruses. Or good fungi. We have a whole bunch of stuff in our intestines that actually help us digest, but not all. And some of those things, if we had a weak immune system, would become a microbial pathogen. So common points of entry, of course, are all the mucous membranes, nasal cavities, our mouth, all that, wounds in the form of cuts, abrasions, punctures, the skin. all those entry points into our ears we can be infected. We just went over. So these are some questions. Explain why rubbing your eyes and nose during flu and cold season or coronavirus. Well, viruses can get in. Okay. Now, so I mentioned there's different parts to the immune system. So this is the second line besides barriers. And this is includes different kinds of cells and defensive proteins that are kind of general part of the immune system, like a cop on the beat. Not looking for anyone in particular, but looking for anything that might cause problems. The necessary components are constantly at the ready for deployment against any invading pathogens that they recognize. Mainly because our own cells have proteins that advertise that they're part of the self, so that these other cells don't attack them. So these are non-specific. In other words, they come across, let's say, a virus that they don't recognize or bacteria, they just go ahead and kill it. And like I mentioned, this part of the immune system must recognize that an invader is present and not self. So if it thinks our own cells are an invader, that'll cause an immune disease, which we'll get to, autoimmune disease. Okay, so here's some of the components, different kinds of cells. So phagocytes are a kind of white blood cell in our body's fluids, in our lymphatic system, in our circulatory system, and they come along and they find, let's say, a bacteria. So here's a phagocyte. And let's say here's a bacteria. And the phagocyte comes along and engulfs that bacteria and destroys it. Okay. There's different kinds of phagocytes. There's macrophages and neutrophils, and there's some other ones as well you don't have to know. But they mark and destroy foreign invaders by engulfing and digesting them, and oftentimes by taking surface proteins from those pathogens and advertising, oh, these things are around. So macrophages are relatively large and may take an hour or more to engulf a pathogen. They have cell membranes and protrusions. They have a nucleus, of course, and they engulf a bacteria. Or neutrophils are another kind of white blood cell. They attack pathogens with antimicrobial chemicals, like cytokines and other things. So they use chemical warfare. So, let's see. Macrophages are larger than neutrophils. Okay. So also, the innate immune system not only has these different lymphocytes or different white blood cells that are kind of general white blood cells, but our innate immune system has some other things up its sleeve. So there's called an inflammatory response. This is why I want you to take a look at the video on inflammation under animations. And the inflammatory system, oftentimes is started, let's say, tissue damage. Let's say we get a puncture wound. the skin is torn. When that happens, skin cells, damaged cells release cytokines and histamines and other chemical signals that act as attractants to white blood cells like macrophages and all that. And so when we get a puncture wound, let's say the bacteria get in, or the bacteria get into our mouth and into our stomach, and let's say they're pathogens, and our microbial system will recognize them and start to try to destroy them. Okay. And then histamines dilate blood vessels and make them leaky so that macrophages can migrate toward the wound, and macrophages and neutrophils and other white blood cells can engulf the bacteria. And then there's also platelets from the blood plasma enter the damaged area to form clots, to gum up the wound so nothing else gets in. So these cytokines are kind of like hormones in that they signal inflammation, but cytokines are used to destroy microbial pathogens. Okay. What are the roles of white blood cells? Certain kinds, in an inflammation, they destroy pathogens and engulf cellular debris. What would happen if histamines were not produced during inflammation? Macrophages would not be able to leave the bloodstream and attack those pathogens. And why is inflammation called a nonspecific part of the immune system? So innate and external defenses and the innate system are part of the non-specific immune response. Okay. And that means part of the general response. So it responds in the same way to any invading pathogen, not to specific ones that, let's say, we've been infected with before and our immune system already knows about them. So this is the animation. So I mentioned about blood clots. When we get, let's say, puncture wound or a major injury or anything like that, the blood clots actually gum up the works. And part of the clotting system is caused by platelets, which are these kinds of cells in our body. They're not just cells, they're actually a bunch of different proteins that stick together and form a gel-like mesh that traps all blood cells and creates a blood clot and kind of seals up the wound. So it reduces blood loss, restores the integrity of an external defense barriers. So if we got punctured and we didn't have this happen, well, we keep bleeding, but also we'd still be open to getting pathogenic bacteria that might cause a problem. So platelets are sticky cell fragments of proteins, and they're part of the innate immune system. How are inflammatory response and blood clotting similar? Both are components of the innate immune system and respond to wounds and other damage. Okay. So I've talked about nonspecific and innate part of the immune system that is a general defense. Like cops walking the beat, they're not looking for any individual person causing a problem, like, let's say, detectives or whatever. They're just looking out for any suspicious behavior. So that's the innate. But then there's something called the adaptive immune system. And like anything that adapts, it evolves. So, what happens is, in the beginning, our immune system, when we're infants, is not very well developed. But we start immediately getting infected with different things, and the immune system starts to learn that, oh, this is a bad thing, this, you don't have to worry about all that. Okay, so over time our adaptive immune system starts recognizing certain invaders that, let's say, cause major disease or minor disease, and then after that, it takes a while for the adaptive immune system to start to recognize things and create the right kind of white blood cells, like lymphocytes, to destroy them. So, but after that's happened, and the next time you get invaded by the same sort of thing, you might be, our immune system is already in place to recognize that, and it tamps it right down. So usually what happens is you get immunity for a certain period of time after being invaded by a certain microbe. Sometimes that immunity will last for a lifetime, and sometimes it will only last for a short time, because microbes evolve as well, and their generation time is much faster, so they can evolve more rapidly. And that's why we have this adaptive immune system. So the main, there's genetics involved. In fact, there's these genes called the major histocompatibility complex. They're found in all vertebrates. They're polymorphic. That means many, many different genes. Hundreds of thousands of, thousands of genes that code for proteins that recognize self and non-self, and that are generated if we're attacked by a microbial pathogen. So once we're attacked, our immune system remembers. They have memory. And so our immune system evolves because over time we keep generating these cells that recognize new pathogens. And this is how we can actually overcome microbial pathogens that can reproduce so much faster than our cells. So this is the third line of defense, tailored against very specific invaders. In other words, it's not non-specific, general, it's very specific to different. So let's say you get infected with measles, or you get a vaccine for measles. Then you have immune system cells that recognize measles if you get infected again, and they knock it down immediately before causing disease. Specialized defensive cells are trained to recognize only one strain of pathogen. So there are thousands and thousands of different white blood cells that are specific to a specific pathogen, or a specific set of pathogens that are related to each other. So this is called the specific response, not non-specific, specific. Now, in addition, we have something called the lymphatic system. It's actually part of the circulatory system, but instead of being closed like our normal circulatory system, it's open, and fluids go through it. But it's also part of our immune system, because there's a lot of immune cells that actually hang out and circulate in the lymphatic system. So our adaptive immune response relies on two main weapons: antibody-mediated immunity. Antibodies are a kind of protein that are specific, have binding sites to a specific pathogens, certain proteins on a pathogen, on, let's say, the outside. And then there's something called cell-mediated immunity. And these are different kinds of white blood cells that either look at our tissue that's been invaded by a microbe, or a microbe in general, and they attack them directly. So immunological memory, in other words, immune memory, is a central part of the adaptive immune system. If you've been attacked before by a certain pathogen, with adaptive immunity, your immune system will recognize that previous invader. They'll always already have white blood cells just for that invader that are circulating. If it comes across that invader again, let's say typhoid fever bacteria or something like that, it will recognize it, attack it, and I'll release chemicals to alert the rest of the immune system that it's being attacked. So that's memory from previous attacks. Our memory cells are two kinds of lymphocytes, B cells and T cells, and they're produced in the bone marrow by stem cells, multipotent stem cells. Okay? And we can actually look at this, where they develop. So, in our bone marrow, we have stem cells right here. Hold on a second. Okay, so we have our bone marrow, and stem cells in the bone marrow form all blood cell precursors. So they do. So this is where it starts. They're in the bone marrow. And then B cells continue developing in the bone marrow, while T cell precursors complete development in the thymus. So these are B cells. They're memory cells, memory white blood cells that also release antibodies and produce antibodies. And they continue to hang out in the bone marrow and also in spleen and also the lymph nodes. And then the stem cells also produce T cells, and they actually mature. So they hang out in the thymus before they're ready. They're kind of immature T cells, and then they mature in the thymus. So mature B and T cells migrate lymph nodes, the spleen, and other tissues, waiting to mount an adaptive response as needed. So let's say circulating T cells that from a previous pathogen are released. If they come across that pathogen, they release that. That starts the whole process of stem cells generating specific kinds of these B and T cells for that specific pathogen in the bone marrow. The thymus is where lymphocytes, T lymphocytes mature. The lymph nodes, T and B lymphocytes, and the lymph nodes respond to foreign invaders in the lymph fluid, so there's a lot hanging out there. We have lymph nodes all over the place. We have them underneath our armpits, around our kidneys, all kinds of different things. In the spleen, it's an organ with all kinds of blood cells, including red blood cells, but they're also full of T and B lymphocytes. And then there's lymphatic vessels. These are all these green vessels here that you see. This is the lymphatic system. So we have a circulatory system that you've already gone over with the heart and all that. But this is the lymphatic system with these blood vessels, these lymphatic vessels all over that can carry lymph fluid, which is this clear white fluid that's also full of different kinds of white blood cells. So just so you know, HIV is a disease that attacks, it's a virus that attacks our white blood cells and destroys our immune system. Measles virus also attacks our B cells and T cells, but it's not, over time it repairs itself. Okay. So antibody-mediated immunity uses antibodies to recognize and attack invaders. What are antibodies? They're kinds of proteins. And these are the kinds of things that our major histocompatibility complex genes I mentioned are responsible for. And that's why with the major histocompatibility complex that I mentioned before, this genes, I think it's on one of the chromosomes. There's many genes that make it's very diverse, and it makes all kinds of different proteins. And the more diverse your MHC is, the stronger your immune system is. Okay, so, and it's responsible for coding for these proteins, these antibodies, that are then released by these blood cells. And these antibodies also recognize non-self markers and self. So they don't attack our own cells, but only foreign cells on the pathogen. Also, there's another thing. Our immune system also protects us against cancer. So that's a different thing entirely. But any cancers, we've gone over this already, any cell that starts multiplying uncontrollably, our immune cells, some certain T cells, recognize that and cause those cells to stop and then to kill themselves. Okay, but back to pathogens and that cause disease. So antibodies are specific to specific pathogens, and so for example, coronavirus, on the outside are these proteins called AC2 receptors. They're part of a spike protein, and this is what we're trying to do, is get immune cells, if we have a vaccine, that will recognize those and make antibodies to those. Okay, and when an antibody that is specific to a certain pathogen, let's say a virus that causes COVID-19, it attaches to it and then marks it like advertising, oh, this is bad, and other antibodies come along and other white blood cells to destroy that. So adaptive immunity, this is antibody-mediated immunity, and this is memory. So specialized lymphocytes that are created and matured in the bone marrow, these produce thousands of antibodies per second, aimed specifically at a specific pathogen that has been recognized. Specific, like E. coli and nothing else. The antibody-mediated immunity, which has to do with memory of previous pathogens, and the production of those antibodies, specific antibodies designed to kill that one specific pathogen. Okay, so that's cell-mediated immunity. Mostly from the B cells, but also from the T cells as well. Certain kinds of T cells called helper T cells that we'll get to. Okay, so here's a B cell on the left. This is part of the adaptive, learned, or memory immune system for very specific defense. Okay, we have these two different lymphocytes that are part of that. There are B cells, and then there are certain T cells that also are part of the cell-mediated defense. Okay, and then there's other T cells that are cell-mediated. So this is antibody-mediated that release these antibody chemicals. Antibodies, proteins that can recognize specific molecules like antigens, they're called, that are non-self. These antibodies also work against certain toxins like snake venom. So if you get bit by a snake, obviously it's going to cause destruction of your cells, but let's say you recover, your immune system oftentimes will remember that venom and you won't get sick from that venom. So in fact, a lot of snake handlers actually inject themselves with small amounts of snake venom to get their immune system cranked up in case they do get bit with a full load of venom. Okay, so here's the influenza virus. It's got surface proteins so that it can latch on to a cell and invade the cell, send in it RNA. It's an RNA virus, and then it's also got these other cell surface proteins that allow the virus to exit the cell. So B cells are memory cells, and they're produced after while we're being invaded by something, and then afterwards they're ready to attack. And what they do is they recognize certain cells or certain pathogens that have been there before, and they generate the cell-mediated antibodies that go on, and this is what these antibodies look like. Okay. BCR is an antibody. And there's all these antibodies that they release, lots and lots and thousands of them. And then you can see this is these antibodies, and when they're released from the white blood cells, they attack and glom onto specific pathogens. Okay, so I've talked about. So there's also cell-mediated immunity that recognizes cells' memory, that cells that have been infected by a pathogen such as a virus, as well as cancer cells. Okay, and there's these T cells. So we talked about B cells. We also talked about general lymphocytes, leukocytes, part of the non-specific immune system, but these are specific to a specific pathogen. These are specialized lymphocytes created in the bone marrow and mature in the thymus. And there's two kinds: helper T cells that recognize markers. So this is part of the memory part of the T cells. Recognize markers on the surface of a cell that have been infected and directs the cell, the B cells and T cells, to kill those cells. And these directs the B cells and killer T cells. So this is actually kind of the quarterback of the adaptive immune system. The helper T cells are the specific white blood cells that recognize specific pathogens and then tell the B cells and the helper T cells, okay, it's time to crank up and start producing thousands and thousands of these different cells, millions of different cells, and to attack that pathogen. And then the killer T cell are called cytotoxic. That means they have a toxin that they release that kills the infected cells by releasing certain kinds of cytokines, so they cannot spread the disease to other cells. In other words, they kill cells, your own cells that have been infected, so that, let's say, the virus doesn't get out. Okay? The only thing that releases antibodies that actually kill the pathogens are the B cells. Okay? The killer T cells attack specific cells that have been infected by the pathogen. Okay. So adaptive immunity resides in the lymphatic system, lymphatic ducts, and associated organs. There's lymph nodes, adenoids, tonsils, the thymus, spleen, lymphatic ducts, in the bone marrow, appendix, various parts. So lymphocytes move around the body through the lymphatic and circulatory system. We've already kind of gone over this, but and then in terms of the production of new lymphocytes before, let's say, the beginning of an specific adaptive immune response, this is the first time we've been infected, there are these stem cells that are generalized white blood cells that differentiate into different kinds of lymphocytes, either B cells or T cells. The T cell lymphocytes are immature and go to the thymus where they mature. The B cells stay in the bone marrow, and they're part of the antibody-mediated or memory immunity, and the T cells are cell-mediated immunity. And they also end up in the lymph, spleen, and other organs, patrolling. Okay. And after that initial invasion, it usually takes a while for this to happen, like the first couple of weeks. That's why it's very hard in the beginning, the first time you've been attacked, to fight off a disease. But after that, it's very easy because these cells they're already hanging out and in our immune system. Okay. So in what way is this immune system adaptive? It adapts to specific invading pathogens, bacteria, viruses, fungal pathogens, multicellular pathogens like worms, river blindness worms, single-celled eukaryotic pathogens like malaria, and it's a generalized response rather than a generalized response to all pathogens. So it's adaptive. It only happens when we're first attacked by a specific pathogen, then it remembers, and our immune system has now evolved to recognize it in the future. Why is the adaptive response the third layer of the immune system? It responds much more slowly than the innate response to pathogens, than the external defenses of the innate immune system, which are generalized, they're ready to go right away. These things actually, the specific lymphocytes have to be made. It takes a while. Okay, so here we are. Adaptive immunity occurs in two stages. The primary immune response. This is the very first time a person is exposed to a particular pathogen. Let's say we're exposed to measles. We get measles. We get infected with the measles virus. Our immune system, it takes a while, the primary immune response, to develop all the different B cells and T cells, including the helper T cells and killer T cells, to go and kill the measles virus. After you've cleared the virus, your immune system has. Then if you get exposed to measles again, you don't have to go through that whole process of primary immune response. So this is the beginning of the immune response. This response takes time because pathogens multiply so rapidly. People infected with an aggressive pathogen first time can lose, and if it's a really, really bad pathogen that can before their immune system can really kick in, they can get really sick and die. So this is the immune memory, the capacity to remember a first encounter with a specific pathogen. These are the cells that are made during the primary immune response that are then used to make new cells during a secondary infection. So memory B and T cells are produced during primary immunity. These memory cells then continue to circulate after the infection, after you've cleared the pathogen and you're all better, enabling us to become to cause an immune cause us to become immune to attack the same strain after we suffered the disease the first time or after we're vaccinated, and to mobilize a speedy and targeted response for future infections. Sorry, I have to fix that. But anyway, you get the idea. These are memory B and T cells that then they just don't disappear after the first time we're infected. They hang out and they're ready to recognize that pathogen again, and they don't have to go through that whole long-term adaptive response. They can ramp up the immune system immediately. So, the secondary immune response, this is the one I'm talking about after we've already been infected once, and then we're infected again. Memory B and T cells are already circulating after the primary immune response. Okay, so they've been made. They're hanging out. When they encounter the pathogen again, they release chemicals that spur the stem cells in the bone marrow and also the other cells to start replicating against that specific pathogen. The memory B cells that release antibodies, and the T cells, helper and killer T cells. So the second encounter with a specific pathogen and the adaptive immune system is poised and ready to go and produces a very fast, more dramatic response. And so oftentimes when this happens, you don't even show any symptoms whatsoever, or they're very mild. Okay, so active immunity. This is acquired immunity. This is after we've been exposed to a pathogen and our adaptive immune system has gone through and developed all these specialized cells for that specific pathogen. So active immunity develops when our own bodies produce antibodies against the pathogen. So if we've been infected with measles and we recover, our immune system immediately recognizes measles virus the next time we might be infected, and it knocks it right down. This occurs naturally. We don't need an outside source to tell our immune system to respond. It happens when we are exposed to a certain pathogen. You can also get active immunity through vaccination. What we're doing with vaccination is we're either taking weakened or dead pathogens, let's say measles virus, dead measles virus, or the antigens on the outside of the virus, and we inject it into the body. The immune system, like during primary immunity, recognizes this is a new pathogen. Let's say the measles vaccine. It starts producing all these B and T cells, and they continue to circulate afterwards. And then if we're actually exposed to the measles again, they're ready to go. Okay. And then there's something called passive immunity instead of active immunity. And this develops when antibodies that were not made by our own bodies are received. So a human fetus requires antibodies from exchanges between its mother's blood, and the mother's blood. A nursing baby receives passive immunity to a broad range of pathogens based on breast milk. Mother's milk is rich in antibodies because the mother's immune system has already encountered many antigens that can be passed on to the baby, to the infant. Okay, so she's passing on antibodies. Passive immunity, because you're just putting on antibodies, not memory cells, no memory cells are produced, wears off as the received antibodies degrade. In fact, actually, sometimes with a new pathogen, we actually harvest the antibodies from that person who survived, and we use those already antibodies for that specific pathogen and inject them into someone who's just been infected to try to protect them, to knock it down. Those are called monoclonal antibodies. Okay, I mentioned that our immune system has to recognize our own cells versus our pathogens or other cells that are not causing us problems, like a whole bunch of bacteria in our gut that are very important in terms of digestion, in terms of making vitamins, all that kind of stuff. So, in fact, our cells are actually releasing chemicals that tell our immune system, oh, we're part of the self. These major histocompatibility proteins that are made by these genes that surround all our cells and say, we're one of the good guys. Okay. Sometimes there's a problem with this, where for some reason our cells, instead of those proteins telling us our cells are ourself, for some reason our immune system goes into overdrive and starts attacking our cells. And there's all kinds of immune diseases. They're called autoimmune diseases, okay? Because they're attacking our own system, our own cells. And there's all kinds of autoimmune diseases that attack specific kinds of cells. So, multiple sclerosis attacks the myelin Schwann cells that surround our neurons that we learned about. And when those cells are degraded, then the nerve impulse leaks and doesn't travel very far, or very well along neurons. And so it's a degenerative neurological disease. Type 1 diabetes, there's two types. The one we're most familiar with has to do with our diet and digestion, and it's kind of a response to, let's say, a situation in the past where our ancestors had famine and it actually helped them survive. Now it doesn't. That's type 2. That's because of our diet and things like that. But type 1 diabetes, what happens is there's some, we don't know what it is, but some virus or bacteria or whatever attacks, may start an immune response that then for some reason attacks the cells in our pancreas. They're called beta cells or beta cells. Beta pancreatic cells. Okay? And these beta cells are the things they're the cells that actually release insulin, the hormone insulin. So they're specific to the pancreas. The pancreas also has other enzymes and stuff that it releases, but insulin, the beta cells are responsible for. So when we eat, our digestive system says, "Oh, there's all this glucose coming into our blood, and so it's time to release insulin, so that the glucose can be so our cells can uptake the glucose and use them in cellular respiration." So the immune system attacks those beta cells, destroys them. After that, people who've suffered that, their beta cells are destroyed period, and then they need insulin for the rest of their lives. Recent advances, stem cell therapy to perhaps replace the defective immune cells. So there's different ways of perhaps new ways of countering. But there's a whole bunch of different autoimmune responses. Rheumatoid arthritis that attacks the cells of our bones and the cartilage around it. There's some autoimmune diseases that attack cells in our eyes and make us blind. All kinds of different ones that happen. There's a big question about maybe it's happening more often now because our immune systems in the past were attacked. We were living in a more dirty environment, and our immune system was properly trained not to overact, and now it does because we live in such a sanitary environment. But that's we're not sure about that. Okay. Vaccination. What is a vaccine? Okay, so we've talked about our adaptive immune system, and that's vaccines actually get our adaptive immune system to adapt. So there's the primary adaptive immune response where we're first infected, let's say with a pathogen or some other antigen, let's say venom or something like that, something that our immune system can actually recognize and then ramp up and destroy. But that primary immune response, if you remember, it takes a while to get up to speed. In fact, the first time, it really might not be up to speed, and you might get so sick you die. Okay? Or you get very sick, or let's say you get a bacterial infection and you get an antibiotic and that kills the bacteria. And then after that, your immune response is a secondary immune response because your immune system has already learned that that's a pathogen or that's a harmful substance, and it's got all these circulating kinds of white blood cells that recognize that in terms of memory. Okay. So for subsequent exposures, we have a very rapid memory response, so rapid in fact that we often don't experience any symptoms at all. This is the basis for vaccination, to provide a first exposure. In fact, what it does is it acts like a primary adaptive immune response, but it doesn't make you sick with that pathogen. It just gives you, it just tells your immune system, oh, this is a pathogen. It's a fake pathogen. And it's time to learn about it and then to try to destroy it. So, in fact, some vaccines actually do cause you to feel a little sick. Namely, that starts the inflammatory response, and it makes you have a fever. And fevers, if you remember, are actually the part of the body's defense to kill pathogens. Okay, so if a sufficiently large percentage of the population is vaccinated against a specific disease, that means all those people have immunity to that disease. Now, there are some people, as I mentioned, let's say who have HIV or other problems with their immune system, where their immune system doesn't work all that well, or it's overreactive, and for which getting a vaccine might not be safe. So what do? Well, if a large enough percentage of the population is vaccinated or has been infected, in other words, they go from susceptible individuals to infected and survive, even the individuals who are still susceptible, in other words, they haven't been vaccinated, they haven't been effective, they will be protected because most of the other people around them will be immune, and there won't be enough of a large population to transmit the pathogen to other people. And so this is what's called herd immunity. Let's see, vaccination. I'll make sure, I'll tell you which one to watch. It's not in chapter 25, I don't think. I'll find out. Anyway, I want you to watch this animation, and I'll tell you where it is. So, what goes in to a vaccine? In other words, how is a vaccine made? Well, often it's composed of non-infective forms of the microbe in question or the antigen in question. We either some of the proteins that, let's say, a virus has on the outside that sometimes you use those to start an immune response, or some other antigen, some poison that causes harm to you, let's say venom from a spider or a snake that's venomous. Okay? So initially, a lot of the microbes were either weak forms of that microbe or killed forms of that microbe. So the first vaccine or vaccination was by Edward Jenner in the 18th century, but for smallpox. The thing is, what people had done before was they would take someone with smallpox, they'd get some of the pus from one of their pustules, and they'd rub it on someone else and give them smallpox. But it was such a small dose that most of the time they would get a mild form of the disease, but after that they would be completely immune to it the rest of their lives. Okay. Well, Edward Jenner found that there's a related virus called cowpox that a lot of young women who were milkmaids would get. They would get these, pox marks on their hands, but they didn't seem to ever get sick from smallpox when smallpox came through. And smallpox was a very, very deadly disease, and was a real scourge. Usually killed about 30% of the people who got it. And so he started taking the pus from these small sores, these pox on these young girls who were milkmaids, and inoculating other people who've never had smallpox. And in fact, he found out that they then had immunity to smallpox. So the pox, there's a whole bunch of different pox viruses that are related to each other, and it just so happens that even though an adaptive immune system is usually just recognizes one pathogen, sometimes there's a pathogen that has various forms, like cowpox versus smallpox. So he recognized that, and then from then on, people learned more and more about it, and finally, a vaccine was actually made once they realized it was a virus. Much later in the, I think the first real vaccine was in the 20th century for smallpox. Okay, so the polio vaccine is, there's two polio vaccines. One is dead virus and the other is weakened virus. The weakened virus, polio infects, is a water or foodborne disease, and usually the first cells that are infected are intestinal cells. And most people don't even get the infection going to their neurons. Okay, so anyway, a successful vaccine stimulates antibody production like a primary immune response. And the memory is long lasting. Usually you're protected in many cases, for the rest of your life against that particular foreign protein or microbe. And that's the secondary immune response. So it provokes, the primary immune response provokes the secondary immune response, but instead of actually having to get sick with a pathogen, the vaccine provides that initial response that then you're protected after that. Okay, so for example, if the memory response is long lasting, then why do we get a flu shot every year? Okay, well, for some reason, our immune system recognizes certain pathogens and provides basically a lifetime immunity. Or not, it might be because the pathogen is fairly stable, doesn't mutate, and so if you have a virus or a bacteria that mutates, and our immune system then doesn't recognize it because, let's say, the surface proteins have changed. Okay, so the flu is like that. So flu is also an RNA virus where it injects its RNA into a cell. So the N protein on neuraminidase, it's actually an enzyme, helps the virus get out of cells, and the H protein helps the virus get into cells. There have been at least 17 different alleles of the H protein. In other words, 17 different kinds, and kind of all give one strain can't be attacked by the immune system versus another strain. So let's say you get one strain of, and you get a vaccine for a couple of different strains. If it's another strain with a different H hemagglutinin, then the vaccine won't work. You don't develop an immune response and a secondary adaptive memory immune response. The same thing with the N protein, at least 9 different alleles. So every year, as flu season comes around, there are different what are called epitopes or strains of flu virus. And certain strains are new and they are not recognized by the immune system. So what happens is scientists recognize they've got this whole network all around the world to identify different strains of flu, and then for the next year they make flu vaccines for the most common strains. So it won't give everybody protection. Like if there's a new strain that's not in the vaccine, it won't protect anybody. Or it might, sometimes these different strains, they're different, so one might provoke a stronger immune response than others. Okay, so that's why with certain diseases we have to get vaccinated yearly, let's say, versus only once. And neuraminidase 1. Now, how does flu virus escape our immune systems? The memory response, let's say, was long-lasting. Why do we need a flu shot every year? Well, I mentioned that it turns out flu viruses mutate rapidly. And when they mutate, during viral replication, mutations arise inside the host cell that may alter certain viral proteins on the outside of the virus. When these proteins are different, our vaccine will not recognize it. It'll be another strain. This mutation is called antigenic drift. Okay? In some case, the altered virus is no longer recognized by our adaptive immune system from the vaccination or from being infected previously, and so it can escape, and if it infects you, you have to generate a primary immune response. You get sick, it takes a while. Okay. That's antigenic drift. Now, there's another way that viral genomes can mutate. They can recombine inside the host to create even greater diversity on the surface proteins. Okay? So, the virus is inside the host. The host cell makes copies. The virus uses RNA to make the host cell produce copies with the nucleotides of the virus. Okay. Let's say you have two different versions of the virus. You have A and B. A has H1, hemagglutinin 1, and okay, that's the first virus. Call that A. And then there's also another strain called H2N2. Okay? And that's B. You can get, oftentimes, when you get infected by a virus, you can get infected by a number of different strains. Okay? Or after a viral infection, you can then be susceptible to a bacterial infection. Anyway, if two different viral particles can occupy the same cell, in other words, they can infect the same cell, they can swap as these viruses are being made, the RNA, they can swap parts of their genome, creating a very different viral strain. So, this is our cell. Inside the cell, there's two different viral genomes, A and B. They recombine and reassort, and you end up with a new strain, and it is called, it's now H2N1 instead of H1N1, H2N2. This one is now H2N1, or you might have one H1N2, or both. When this happens, so now you've got these different proteins, it's likely to evade your immune system. This is called antigenic shift versus anti-drift. Okay. So, you have to know this. So there's a difference between antigenic drift and antigenic shift. Antigenic drift is a mutation while there's viral replication, and you create a new allele. The virus creates a new allele. That's antigenic drift. Okay. Antigenic shift means there's recombination of both, two different strains, and you get a new virus with alleles from both new strain. The new recombinant virus might have new properties that allow it to infect cells that it normally wouldn't, like, let's say, the 1918 flu, or the SARS, another coronavirus that emerged about 15 years ago. Now, so the 1918 virus was an influenza virus, the same one, similar one that causes seasonal flu, but it had undergone, they've actually recovered it from graves of people who died from this flu in 1918, and they sequenced it and they realized there had been an antigenic shift. In other words, recombination that provided a virus that was much more virulent. That means it caused more harm, and it was also much more transmissible and contagious. So it could not only infect the upper respiratory cells that we usually get infected from flu, but it could also infect other kinds of cells as well, and that's why it was so deadly. Okay. There's been a vaccine controversy. It's still ongoing. For some reason, some people think it's more dangerous to get a vaccine than to get the disease. Now, that's not true. Vaccines provide protection. So let's say there's a vaccine for measles. There's actually a combination vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella. The MMR vaccine. And some people claim that it causes autism in youngsters, in babies. This is a correlation. If you think about it, when do you get this vaccine? You get it within the first 12 months of your life. When does autism show up? Usually after the first year. Some people have associated the vaccine with autism. And it was even a doctor who claimed that was true in the United Kingdom. But it was a hoax. Okay? And that hoax has taken hold, and it scared a lot of people. And now they don't want to give their kids the vaccine because they think it's going to give them autism, even though it doesn't. The thing is, measles is a lot more dangerous. It's not a very dangerous disease. Most people get it. They get sick for a couple of weeks. They get spots all over themselves. And then they get better. Okay? But a certain proportion, small, get really sick. They get a neurological condition that's associated with it and a bunch of other things, and sometimes they die. So now in the United States, the rate is very low. But in other countries, in Africa, let's say, when you have a measles outbreak, a lot of people die, like, might be 1% mortality rate, which is fairly high. Okay. So measles, the vaccine actually protects, and it doesn't cause autism, no matter what anybody might say. They've tested that. Obviously, you don't want to give a vaccine that would do that. But measles, like I said, can be a dangerous disease. It also can be a dangerous disease with children. Usually they recover fairly quickly, but adults that get it seem to suffer worse from it, and then people with bad immune systems will die from it. In other words, one of the reasons you give a vaccine is to create herd immunity for a bunch of people who can't get the vaccine because they have a weakened immune system. Okay. It turns out measles, what cells does it attack? Well, it's an upper respiratory disease, but it also infects our white blood cells, our macrophages. And when those macrophages and neutrophils get infected, they then go to our lymph nodes, they infect other of our immune cells, and then our whole immune system kind of shuts down. And all the memory cells that we've actually made, for adaptive immunity, for some reason they're wiped out. And because of that, even though measles itself does not generally cause death or serious disease, there's this temporary loss of immunity in terms of adaptive immunity. In other words, let's say you have a person who hasn't had measles yet, but they've had a whole bunch of other diseases that they've actually developed an immune response to, that they're protected from because of memory immune response. But then the measles virus infects them. It actually destroys, temporarily diminishes their immune response, their adaptive immune response, and all these other diseases that they were protected against because they had already had those diseases. They are now susceptible again, and they get them. And so this laboratory in New York, a guy named Mina, he looked at measles incidence and non-measles infectious disease mortality, or measles-induced immunomodulation, where the measles has diminished the memory response of all the previous kinds of white blood cells that a young child might have. And they're now susceptible to a bunch of non-measles diseases. They might be bacterial diseases, they might be other viral diseases that are fairly mild. The child gets it, they get a little sick, and then they develop immune response. It might wipe all those out. Well, those different viral strains of other things they had been infected with previously, there might be some strains that are more virulent and more harm-causing than others. Okay? And that's exactly what it looks like has happened. They're usually, when There's a rising incidence of measles. There's a rising incidence of secondary mortality because the measles has infected their cells and immune cells and destroyed them. Now, a measles vaccine, of course, doesn't cause measles. It protects you against it. So it also protects you against those secondary infections because your immune system doesn't suffer from an actual measles infection. So, to vaccinate or not. So, a lot of people don't actually aren't very good judges of risk. For example, people are generally a lot more afraid of sharks than they are of car accidents, even though car accidents and driving in a car, the risk is much, much higher than actually getting eaten by a shark. Okay, so science teacher Anna Eaton learned that many mothers were choosing not to vaccinate their children, fearing negative side effects. The CDC recommends that children receive 10 vaccines given over a total of 24 doses between birth and 15 months of age. One of those vaccines is MMR. It's a combination of measles, mumps, and German measles or rubella. So I don't know. I forget what happened with this teacher. Maybe she had a kid and she didn't vaccinate. She was too afraid, and maybe the kid got measles and died. Rubella. When the body's immune system is exposed to a vaccine against a virus, like a flu shot, the immune system recognizes the viral protein as an invader, and it mounts a primary immune response. Upon later exposure, the actual flu virus, let's say, a vaccinated individual's immune system is already armed for the secondary response and can fight it right away and before anybody gets sick. The protein itself cannot cause the flu because, in terms of the protein, that's the basis of the vaccine, because it doesn't contain any genetic material, or if it does, it's a dead virus and cannot make copies of the flu virus. Okay. So, a vaccine, you get infected with a harmless form of the virus, either a dead virus, a weakened virus, or antigen surface proteins under the skin. The vaccine stimulates the immune system to produce antibodies, in green, that recognize the virus. And it also stimulates the T cells to recognize the virus. Then, let's say you actually get infected with a real disease. You've already got, first of all, antibodies, and you've got these B cells that produce the antibodies, and you've got T cells that attack the organism, and so you don't get sick because you've got a secondary immune response that happens right away. Okay. So, vaccines save lives. There's all kinds of diseases that were major killers of people. The first big vaccine I already told you about from Edward Jenner in the 18th century was smallpox. It killed on average about 30%. But anywhere from 10 to even 50 or 60% of the people who got it. Very, very bad disease. It's a respiratory disease, but it's not as infectious as, let's say, the flu, but it's a lot worse. In other words, flu kills 0.1% of the people who get it, usually older people. Smallpox killed everybody. Another one, diphtheria, was another childhood disease that caused a lot of problems. They developed a vaccine for that. whooping cough, or pertussis here. Because people aren't getting whooping cough vaccine because they're afraid of autism and things like that, all of a sudden we're seeing a lot more cases of whooping cough. And whooping cough, it's a really fairly serious disease of the respiratory system, and really bad cases can kill. Polio. Oh, by the way, smallpox has been eradicated completely. They used a vaccine, they inoculated enough people, and the only host for smallpox is humans. No one had smallpox after a certain point, and so there's no more smallpox in the world today. No one gets a vaccine for it, you don't need it. Polio is almost the same thing. Okay, so most people think of polio, they have trouble, they get paralyzed. The first cells that get infected with polio are intestinal cells, and usually people who get polio, that's all they get. They get an intestinal infection, it clears up, and nothing happens. But in a small number of people, but still significant, the virus not only infects the intestinal cells, but also infects neurons, peripheral neurons, and then climbs up the neurons into the spinal column, where it causes a secondary infection and causes lesions that kill the neurons in the spinal column. And that's why people with polio, some of them get paralyzed. Okay, so polio, it turns out there's still some cases of polio in Pakistan, mainly, and Afghanistan, mainly because the Taliban keep trying to kill the people, healthcare workers who are giving people vaccines, and also in Africa. And then there's other infectious diseases. There's now an Ebola vaccine. That is brand new. It took quite a while to develop, that actually protects people against Ebola. And so these Ebola outbreaks that we've had are going to start not being so terrible. It's a very bad disease. Oh, another vaccine, tetanus. And tetanus was a very, very serious vaccine. Disease. Sometimes up to 90% of the people who got it died from it. Pertussis was about 5% mortality. That's still pretty high. Rabies, there's a vaccine for that. If you get bit by a rabid dog, let's say, it takes a while for the virus to get into your brain, and you can get a vaccine that will counteract it. So after vaccinations, which diseases had okay, that's not. Okay.